Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us for the initial part of our program on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to check that cell phones have been turned off. That's always appreciated by our guests and those recording the events. I would like to also thank Steve Moore, my colleague here at Heritage, for arranging our special guest's appearance tonight. And also note, as we have been asked to do by PBS, that residents in the D.C. area will be able to view tonight's film again. And again, it's titled Walter Williams, Suffer No Fools, on public television at WHUT, the Howard University Television Channel 32 here in Washington. That will appear tomorrow night, the 28th at 8 p.m. And for those who are insomniacs, it will appear on Wednesday night at 12 midnight for your viewing, so you can see it twice. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Williams. I will first introduce our host and then introduce the doctor. Steve Moore, of course, serves as chief economist here at Heritage. He previously wrote on the economy and public policy for the Wall Street Journal and was on their editorial board. He was a senior economist of the U.S. Congress Joint Economic Committee under Dick Armey of Texas. He founded the Club for Growth in 1999 and served as its president until 2004. And before joining the Journal, he founded the Free Enterprise Fund to continue advocating for free market economic policy solutions. Earlier in his career, and he did live above it, he was the Heritage's Grover M. Herman Fellow in Budgetary Affairs, so there is life after Heritage and returning to it. Our special guest is, of course, Dr. Walter E. Williams. If you learn one thing this evening, please remember the E is for excellent. Dr. Williams holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics from California State University, Los Angeles, and MA and PhD degrees in economics from UCLA. He holds a Doctor in Humane Letters from Virginia Union University and Grove City College, and a Doctor of Laws from Washington and Jefferson College. He has served on the faculty of George Mason University in Fairfax as the John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics since 1980. From 1995 to 2001, he was chairman of the GMU Economics Department. He has also served on the faculties of Los Angeles City College, California State University, Los Angeles, Temple University, and Grove City College. He is the author of over 150 publications that have appeared in both scholarly journals and popular publications. He is the author of 10 books, including America, A Minority Viewpoint, The State Against Blacks, which was later made into the PBS documentary Good Intentions. And considering tonight's program title, Steve, I'm worried why the two of us are on this stage at this point. But I will be glad to be disappearing so he only has one of us to suffer with tonight. Steve.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for showing up this evening. We're so thrilled to have the great Walter Williams. I went to George Mason University, got my economics degree there, and learned a lot of economics from Walter, as I think a lot of you in this room have. So, Walter, thank you so much for being here. We want to make this kind of fun and conversational, so I'm going to start by asking Walter some questions. Then we'll just open up for questions, and then we'll watch this incredible film about Walter and his life and the mark that he's left on economics. Walter and I have been friends for about 25 years. We used to, at the Cato Institute picnic every year at Ed Crane's house, we used to play one-on-one basketball every year. And finally, he beat me, I think, 6 years in a row. And one year, I said, come on, Walter, let's get out there. And he said to me, not this year, Steve. No, I'm not playing anymore. And I said, come on, Walter, let's go. Let's get out there and do it. And I said, are you afraid of losing to me? And he said, Steve, here's the problem. He said, if I lost to you in basketball, I could never go back and talk to my people. And I just thought that was very charming. So let's start with a lot of the more controversial things that you've written about Walter in your life, the things that you're most known for, but also most controversial, and especially your book on the state against blacks, because this is an entirely unconventional view. Most people in this town view the state and a lot of the government programs and taxation programs as aiding minorities, and especially blacks. And you're making the argument in your writings for 30, 40 years and in your book that, in fact, policies like the minimum wage, the expansion of the welfare state have actually been a setback for minorities. How do you defend yourself against your critics?
Well, if you look at the minimum wage, most Americans support the minimum wage and increase in the minimum wage because they have good intentions. They think that, gee, it will help low-skilled people earn higher living. But when you look at public policy, you should not look at the intentions behind public policy. You should ask the question, what are the effects? And you can see the effect of the minimum wage law if you put yourself in the place of an employer. And you say, and you have to pay $7.25 an hour to no matter whom you hire. Well then, would you hire a worker who is so unfortunate so as to have skills that would only enable him to produce $3 or $4 worth of value per hour? Well, most employers will look at that as a losing economic proposition. That is to pay somebody $7.25 when that somebody could only produce $4 worth of value per hour. And so the effect of the minimum wage law is to discriminate against the employment of low-skilled people. And if you look at
wait a minute, those are the people who are going to get the minimum wage.
No, they're not going to get a job in the first place. That is, there's the lowest skilled people, the employer just will not hire them. Now, in the absence of a minimum wage law, if he could pay them $3 or $4 an hour, $5 an hour, well, they could be employed and they would learn something on the job. They get on-the-job training and ultimately be worth $7.25 or even more than that. So what the minimum wage law does, it cuts off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. And if you look for the empirical evidence of this, you just look at our labor force, and you see that the unemployment rate among teenagers is the highest. And teenagers are low-skilled because they lack the experience, the maturity, and other attributes of adults. And among that group are black teenagers who not only share the handicaps of teenagers in general, but they share the additional handicaps of often going to rotten schools, getting fraudulent education, poor backgrounds, rotten neighborhoods, and early work experiences are very, very important for people who have this kind of background. Now, there's something else about the minimum wage law that nobody considers, and I point that out in a book I wrote in 1989. It's called South Africa's War Against Capitalism. And in that book, I do a study of labor markets in South Africa during its apartheid era. And I give citation after citation of racist unions in South Africa who would never have a black as a member, were the major supporters of minimum wage laws for blacks. And their stated reason was to make the wage high enough so that employers would not hire black workers, they would hire white workers. So it turns out that the minimum wage is the most effective tool in the arsenal of racists everywhere in the world. And let me just give one more example on minimum wage law. The first minimum wage law in our country was the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931. And the Davis-Bacon Act says that all workers in federally funded or federally assisted construction projects must be paid the prevailing wage. And if you look on page 6513 of the Congressional Record on March 31st, 1931, you'll see congressional testimony where congressmen will say, see that contractor over there? He brings cheap colored labor up from the South, puts them in cabins, and it's labor of that sort that has to compete, that white Americans are competing against. It was all kinds of testimony in support of the Davis-Bacon Act that demonstrated that they wanted to keep blacks out of construction. Wow. And see, the tragedy of it is that the Davis-Bacon Act is still on the books today. And another part of the tragedy is that black congressmen, they also support the Davis-Bacon Act. Now, they support the Davis-Bacon Act because unions want the Davis-Bacon Act. Now, the people who support the Davis-Bacon Act today, they just don't use the same rhetoric. They use a more enlightened rhetoric in support of the Davis-Bacon Act. But the minimum wage law, any kind of minimum, or any kind of regulation on prices, it discriminates against less preferred people. I mean, if you ask the question, and one example I frequently give talking about setting prices, any kind of price control, it discriminates against less preferred people. I often ask people, suppose you saw a fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking man, and he's married to a beautiful young lady. What kind of prediction would you make about that man's income? You would guess that it's pretty high. And what is he doing? He's telling the beautiful young lady, look, I can't compete for your hand on the basis of a guy like Williams. So I'm going to offset my handicap by offering you a higher price. And so decent people might say, well, gee, is it fair for beautiful young ladies to treat fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking men any differently than they treat handsome men? And they'll say no. And then you make a law saying that that beautiful young ladies can't charge fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking men higher prices than they charge handsome men. Then you say, well, then what happens to the probability of a fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking man marrying a beautiful young lady? What you've done by regulating prices, you've taken away his most effective means of competing with the more preferred man by offering higher prices. And so that's the same thing when you regulate any price. You handicap less preferred people.
So if Jesse Jackson were here, or some of the more liberal economists, they would respond to what you're saying by saying, well, look, maybe some people will lose their jobs. But, you know, if you look at the statistics, a disproportionate share of the people who get minimum wage are blacks and Hispanics, minorities. And Walter Williams, you are denying these people a pay raise. And then they would ask you, and I want you to respond to this, they'd say, well, Walter Williams, do you want no minimum wage? I mean, should there be no minimum wage that you could pay someone 50 cents a dollar? You're just going to drive those wages down to the least common denominator.
Well, first of all, that would be untrue, but I would answer the question, yeah, I would want no minimum wage, because what the minimum wage law does, I believe in people's right to contract and be able to engage in peaceable voluntary exchange at mutually beneficial or mutually agreeable terms. And the minimum wage law interferes with that. And matter of fact, the courts for a long time in the United States held that same position, that the minimum wage law violated the right of contract. And you look at the Children's Hospital versus Atkins case, and where the court said that it violated the freedom of contract. And it wasn't until the 1938, I believe, is West Coast Hotel versus Parish, I believe. That's the case where the court eventually said, well, gee, the minimum wage law is constitutional. But however, they were under threat of Roosevelt packing the court, so it was they say sometimes the switch in time that saved none.
Right.
And so I believe that people have the right to negotiate. And then also a lot of people say the minimum wage law is an anti-poverty device. It reduces poverty. Well, that doesn't even pass the smell test. I mean, because if it were an anti-poverty device, rather than our spending all these millions and billions of dollars in foreign aid, we just tell Bangladesh and Haiti, you could be rich like we are, just have a higher minimum wage. That's just utter nonsense. And then also, the empirical evidence on the minimum wage law, in 1948, the unemployment rate among black teenagers was 9.4%.
1948.
1948. The unemployment rate among white teenagers was like 10.2.
So it's lower.
It was lower.
Lower for blacks than whites.
Yeah, and the labor force participation rates for black teenagers were greater than white teenagers. Matter of fact, it was 106%. And so you say, well, how come in 1948? Was there less discrimination? Is that why? Or were blacks more in 1948 higher skilled than whites? No, it was the minimum wage law. And then also the extent of coverage of the minimum wage law, because when it first came out, I think, I'm not absolutely sure, it only covered about 40-some% of jobs. And so if you were thrown out of a job because of minimum wage law, there was this uncovered sector that you could go to. But now I think the minimum wage law covers like 98% or virtually all jobs.
So what are some of the other federal policies or state, local policies that are meant to help minorities that you think actually have the opposite effect?
Well, one example is not, it's a local regulation. It's the licensing of many business and occupations. One that I talk about in my book and also on film here is the licensing of taxi cabs. I mean, that is, what does it take to become an owner-operator of a taxi? Well, you have to go out and buy a car, a used car. You have to maybe get some kind of insurance and some knowledge of the city and a driver's license. Well, you need much more than that today. That is, a poor, illiterate Italian in the 20s, in the 1920s, he just had to go out and buy a used car and write the word taxi on, and he was in business. Well, it turns out that in Philadelphia, you in order to own and operate one taxi, you have to go out and buy a license. They call it a medallion. And the license costs $400,000. In New York, the license to own and operate one taxi is $700,000, and a corporate license is over $1 million. These are for one taxi. And so you say, well, what is the effect of a law that generates that kind of license price? Well, it tends to discriminate against people getting into business who don't have $700,000 hanging around or the bank credit to be able to get a loan. And so it discriminates against people at the bottom of the ladder. And the reason why you have these licensing laws is that insiders want to have a license law so they can keep outsiders out and charge higher prices. And if you look at cities, like compare Washington, D.C. and New York, where the number of taxis in Washington, D.C. per 1,000 of population is much greater than New York. I think when I did the study, it's like 12 taxis per 1,000 population. In New York, it's 2.4. The prices are cheaper. But however, there's a movement in Washington to get taxis licensed here, and particularly the big companies.
Right. So nobody takes taxis anymore. Everybody uses Uber.
Yeah, right.
So what do you think of that kind of, this new kind of disruptive technology where these new, now anybody can just, become an employee of Uber and they don't have to get a taxi medallion, and they can go out and drive a cab. It might be a kid who's in graduate school or something wants to make. Is that something you think? Now
that's wonderful.
People would say, well, but you know what? I mean, it's interesting because when I first came here, most of the taxi cab drivers were black. Now they're, 24-year-old, white kids or senior citizens. And so this, some advocates of the minorities say, look at what this is doing. This is driving blacks out of this industry.
Well, I think one of the very, very important things is that you have to decide what is a racial issue and what is not a racial issue. Now, that is people who are sellers, they love a monopoly because the monopoly gives them an opportunity to charge higher prices. Now, you'll love a monopoly in what you sell, whether you're black or white. And so if you go to New York and you start saying, well, let's get rid of licensing of taxis, well, the black drivers are going to be against you too. Because, everybody likes a monopoly. People like a monopoly in what they sell and competition in what they buy.
So what about the school system? How would you fix it? I mean, you've lived in Philadelphia. You work here in the Washington area. You've seen some of the lousy inner city schools. It seems like there's a lot of resistance to fixing them, even among the minority leaders.
Well, I think it's beyond lousy. That's not the term. That is, it's virtually criminal. That is, the average American does not know that the average black kid who's in the 12th grade, and these are the National Assessment Education Policy, they do tests. The average black kid who's in the 12th grade, he has the writing, computational, and reading skills of a white 7th grader or 8th grader. Now, so it means that many of these kids are getting high school diplomas, and the high school diploma attests that they can read and write and compute at a 12th grade level, when in fact they cannot read and write and compute at the 8th grade level. That is fraud. that is utter fraud by the education establishment. Now, the education establishment, the rotten education that many black kids get can be attributed to many things. Poor parenting, kids who have alien and hostile minds to the education process, and there are many, many things that the education establishment cannot control. But however, they can control the conferring of a degree. And they should not confer a degree to a person should not confer a 12th grade diploma to a kid who cannot read and write at the 8th grade level. And the tragedy of it is that most black people do not know this. And
They don't know, wait, they don't know what?
they don't know that the kids are having a fraudulent education. Okay. And then when these kids go to college, they go to college under affirmative action, and they're getting in on terms other than other people. And so most kids, black kids, they don't graduate.
So you're against affirmative action?
Well, I'm against making choices by race.
You are. Now,
Except in marriage, I discriminate that way.
now, so let me ask you. I don't want to focus too much, or especially not exclusively on racial issues here, but there's something that's puzzled me. If all your theories are right, and then the welfare state has hurt people, the public school system has hurt blacks, the minimum wage is hurting blacks. All these, the war against blacks that you're talking about, the state against blacks. Yet the people who support these programs obviously are the Democratic Party. They prop up these programs. They tell minorities that these are programs that are going to help them. And last time I looked, Democrats, somewhere between 90 and 95% of blacks today vote for the Democratic Party. The very programs that you say, who espouse the very programs that you say are hurting blacks. Mm-hmm. How do you explain that paradox?
Well, I think that the programs hurt the blacks near the bottom the most.
Okay.
Now, there are blacks who in the upper class, they benefit. For example, the public education establishment, that is most black professionals, most blacks who have a BA degree, have the degree in primary or secondary education. Uh-huh. I believe for women, it's like 46%, and I think men are around 40-some%. So they have a vested interest in the status quo, in the public education establishment. And they don't want a voucher system, or they don't want tuition tax credits. They don't want anything that would introduce competition, because they want a monopoly. And if you're part of a monopoly, if you're benefiting from the monopoly, you want the monopoly. And so they have to tell themselves, I don't know what they tell themselves, that they're somehow doing the best things for blacks, but that's what they're doing. And if you look at the politics of it, and I pointed out in the documentary that many people think, many black people think, that salvation can be gained through the political arena. Mm-hmm. That is to vote in black mayors, black policemen, chief of police, and school superintendents. And if you go to the cities around our country, if you say, well, where's the worst education? It's in the very cities where a black is the mayor, the chief of police, and superintendent of schools. I'm talking about places like Washington, D.C., and Detroit, and other cities. And now, I'm not stating that there's a causal relationship there, but what I'm stating is that the political arena just doesn't, there's no guarantee for economic well-being. And if you look across our country, you say, well, look, what ethnic group stands at the top of the socioeconomic heap? Well, it turns out, for the most part, it's Japanese Americans. And Japanese Americans don't have political power, even in areas where they're the most numerous, such as San Francisco. And if you look across our history, the group in the United States who's had the most political power has been Irish Americans. And Irish Americans were the slowest rising of any of the ethnic groups. And so I think it's a mistake for people to think, and I think, unfortunately, many black people think that if we can put some black politicians, that we'll be better off. Well, you say, well, what about Washington, D.C.? And what about the President of the United States? Some people, I call him sometimes a white black person, because it's half and half, but just like they call Zimmerman a white Hispanic,
So let's talk about Barack Obama for just a minute. I mean, we've had now for 6 years America's first black president. A lot of people thought that this would lead to, and hoped that this would lead to, a kind of post-racial society where a lot of these racial issues would be de-emphasized and would become more of a colorblind society. And yet, it's almost inarguable that we're almost more racially divided now than we were before Barack Obama was elected. What went wrong?
Well, I think it's the American people that went wrong. I don't blame the president as much as I blame the American people. But
what do you mean by that?
Well, this is the first time in our history, in our entire history, that a person could have been elected to the highest office in the land who had a long-time association with people who hated our country, such as Reverend Wright, such as Bill Ayers and Bernadine and his wife and others, And what does that say about the American people? That is, who would elect such a person to the highest office in the land? I wrote a column long before Barack Obama became president, and I point out that my prediction is that he's going to turn out to be a failed presidency, something like Jimmy Carter. And now some people are saying that he's making Jimmy Carter look good. But it's, again, I think it's people putting false hope in the political arena. I mean, I think it reflects something else about the American people. Unfortunately, I believe that the American people have lost love and respect for the United States Constitution. I believe that the American people have utter contempt for the United States Constitution. And this contempt brings people into office like Barack Obama or like George Bush and others. And my evidence for contempt, my charge of the American people having contempt for the Constitution, is ask yourself the following question. In 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. James Madison, the acknowledged father of the Constitution, he stood on the floor of the House irate. And he said, I'm virtually quoting him, he says, I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article in the Constitution that allows Congress to spend the money of their constituents for the purposes of benevolence. Now, if you look at the federal budget today, 2/3 to 3/4 of it is for the purpose of benevolence. What do you think would happen to a politician? What do you think the American people would do to a politician today who would say the same thing that James Madison said? They would eat him up alive. Because what the American people believe in, they believe that politicians should be able to facilitate their right to live at the expense of another person. That is, the American people believe that politicians should use the power of their office to take what belongs to one American and bring it back to them. Now,
well, Williams, do you want people starving in the street? Do you want people going homeless?
People did not starve in the streets in America. If people say, well, you have to have food stamps because people are starving in the street. Well, I would ask you, in 1848, when the Irish were fleeing the potato famine, landing in New York with nothing, how'd they make it? Was there a food stamp program? How'd they make it? Or most elderly people died in the homes of their children throughout our whole history. There's no history of people dying on the streets and and starvation and stuff like in our country. We help, people need help, but we're very charitable people. And I believe in helping one's fellow man. I think it's praiseworthy and noble to help one's fellow man by reaching into your own pockets. To help one's fellow man by reaching in somebody else's pockets, I think it's worthy of condemnation. And any of us who are Christians, for the Christians among us, when God gave Moses the commandment, thou shalt not steal, I'm sure he did not mean thou shalt not steal unless you got a majority vote in Congress.
So what did you make of what Hillary said the other day? Hillary Clinton said that businesses don't create jobs. Was she right?
But I think that she get a lot of sympathy from the American people. Jimmy, just like Obama said, you did not produce that.
Right, you did not build that, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't know. But there's a certain rationality of the American people. Imagine I'm running for the Senate in your state. Let's say it's Pennsylvania. And I go back and forth across the state campaigning. And I say, look, my fellow Pennsylvanians, I've read the United States Constitution. If you elect me to the office, I'm going to uphold and defend the United States Constitution. So don't expect if you elect me to office, don't expect for me to bring back money for aid to higher education, highway construction funds, prescription drugs, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think I would get elected to the Senate from Pennsylvania? No, I wouldn't. And the tragedy of it is that Pennsylvanians would be doing the absolute right thing by not electing me to the office. Because if I don't bring back all these goodies, it doesn't mean that Pennsylvanians will pay a lower federal income tax. All that it means is New Jersey will get it instead.
Well, so what do we do about this? I mean, we're in a paradox where everybody just gets what they can get, and how do we put the toothpaste back in that tube?
Well, you ask yourself the following question. I think the answer lies somewhat in this question, and that is, are the American people as human beings, are we any different from the Romans, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, Britain, the English, great empires of the past that went down the tubes for mostly bread and circuses? Are the American people any different from that?
So do you think
I don't know.
A lot of people think that it's too late to turn back and reverse things. And I wonder, like, for example, people say, oh, we're getting near a tipping point where so many people are dependent on government that there's no turning back. I mean, are you a pessimist or an optimist on, is it too late to turn things around?
Well, I have a very good friend and colleague, longtime friend and colleague, Thomas Sowell. When we talk on the phone, he said, Walter, the only thing good about being our age is when the stuff really hits the fan. We'll be gone. Now,
that's pretty pessimistic.
No, but however, I think that if there's an optimistic note, is that American people have never done the wrong thing for the long time. We always manage to get our house to act together. But we are close to the point that we don't have much time to get our act together. I think that we need to have extensive cuts in spending. And I think that the only way politically you can do it is to have something like a meat-axe approach, something like a 10% across the board, because people who are beneficiaries of various programs, they'll rally politically against you. But I don't see Americans supporting that until there's some catastrophe in our country. Maybe they will. But I could be absolutely wrong, and I hope I'm wrong. But
So-
my daughter and her recently got married a couple of years ago, and they were asking me some recommendations for the future. And so I said, well, you ought to try to save and hide in your own property about $40,000 or $50,000 in gold coin not as an investment, but as a way to get out of our country. And they said, well, where do you go? Well, so I said, well, New Zealand, Australia. And I said, but where to go is not a very important question when things get bad, just anywhere other than. So things can get rough. And history shows that in other great civilizations of the past. And so again, this question, are we any different?
So you're obviously one of the strongest advocates for the free enterprise system that we have in this country, and thank you for that. I've heard you talk many times, and I love the story you tell about how it is that, I wonder if you could share this with the folks here. How is it that people in New York City, where there are no cows and no cattle, how do they get steak at night?
Well, one of the things I was arguing with, I was making the point that many people think that good is done by caring for others. And my point is, when people ask me, well, what's that human motivation that gets the most wonderful things done? I say greed. I'm not talking about ripping off people, robbing and fraud and stealing. I'm talking about people trying to get as much as they can for themselves. Now, most people don't, they never looked at it that way. I asked the question. I say, well, look, last winter you had Texas cattle ranchers getting up in the dead of night in blizzards, going out, rounding up stray cows, trying to take care of the cows, make sure they're eating, and making this personal sacrifice so that New Yorkers would have beef on their shelves. You have Idaho potato farmers getting up doing back-breaking work, sun beating down, and fingernails, dirt underneath their fingernails, bug bites, and making this personal sacrifice so that New Yorkers also have potatoes on the shelves. Now the question is, why are they doing that? Do you think it's because they love New Yorkers? They may hate New Yorkers. I'm not that wild about New Yorkers myself. They may hate New Yorkers, but they make sure that beef and potatoes gets New York every single day of the week. Why? Because they want more for themselves. And that's the great virtue of the free market system, is the way you get more for yourself is by serving your fellow man, making your fellow man happy. And that's what the free market is about. And matter of fact, if you ask the question, the pursuit of profits, in another way to put it, if you ask the question, if you just look around, you look at what do Americans complain about? Well, do we complain about supermarkets? What about our computer stores? Are there a lot of complaints about the clothing stores? No. Where do people complain? They complain about public schools, complain about the post office, the motor vehicles department. Compare. Now, cars and television sets and clothing and supermarkets, they're motivated by profits. The public education, the motor vehicle department, and post office, they're nonprofit organizations. So profit, being profit motivating, is profit motivation gets people to try to please their fellow man. Because in the free market, they get more for themselves by serving their fellow man.
So why is this is the last question I'll ask, then we'll open it up to you all. Why is this such a tough sell? I mean, it's so obvious what you're saying, to people who understand the way the world works. And it's just...
One of my books, Race and Discrimination, that I point out that I show that the black family was just as intact as most other families. That is, in 1880s, depending on what city, 75% to 80% of blacks lived in two-parent families. The blacks are 51% of homicide victims, and the perpetrator is like 96%. So many of the things that we see among black people is entirely new. But there's also something else that's very, very important to stress, is that black people as a group have made the greatest gains over some of the highest hurdles in the shortest period of time than any other racial group in the history of mankind. And why do I say this? Is that if you just added up the income that black Americans earn each year and thought of us as a separate nation, we would be the 17th or 18th richest nation. There was a black American who led the world's mightiest military, Colin Powell. There are a few black Americans who are among the world's richest people, and there are many black Americans who are among the most famous people. Now, the significance of this is that in 1865, neither a slave, ex-slave, or slave owner would have believed that this kind of progress would be possible in just a little bit over a century. And as such, it speaks, I mean, it's a testament to the intestinal fortitude of a people, but just as important, it speaks to the greatness of a nation in which these kind of gains are possible. They could not have been possible anywhere else on the face of this earth. Now, so the big question that's before us is how to extend these gains for 35% of black people for whom they appear to be elusive. And that's that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind.
Well, what's the answer?
This huge, we inferred some of the answers. I think the basic answer is liberty. I mean, when you tell people, when you make poverty comfortable, then people will will accept poverty. I mean, a lot of people, the labor force participation rate among Americans in general is the highest that has been since I think 1960s. Mm-hmm. And the reason why the labor force participation rate is the rate at which a particular demographic group is active in the population. Well, there are many people who won't take a $7.50 a job from McDonald's or whatever. But however, not taking that job does not mean starvation. But if it did mean starvation, they'd go out and take the job. They wouldn't, because they can depend on welfare or unemployment compensation. I believe that the duration of unemployment has doubled since 1948. It could have been more than doubled, the duration of unemployment. Why? Because unemployment compensation makes people somewhat comfortable.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Williams, when you advocate for the freedom to contract, would you extend that to the freedom to not hire someone on any basis whatsoever? And what I'm referring to specifically is the laws that prohibit someone from discriminating on the basis of all kinds of sex and race and religious.
Yes, I would. I mean, I believe that for example, in free speech, the true test of one's commitment to free speech does not come when you allow people to be free to say those things that you think they should say. It comes when you allow people to say those things that you find despicable. Similarly, with the freedom of association, the freedom of association does not come when you allow people to associate in ways that you think is right. The true test comes when you allow people to associate in ways that you find despicable. Now,
should people be able to associate in the Ku Klux Klan?
Yeah, if they want to, as long as they don't violate somebody else's property rights. I mean, if there's a private club, then I think that they have the right to say, well, Williams, we don't want you in. Or if there's however, in a public library where I pay taxes or anything else that's public, I think that, no, they don't have the right to discriminate by race. But in terms of whatever is privately owned, I think people have the right to, they should have the right to discriminate on any basis that they want. Now, that doesn't mean that I like it, but I respect their right. But on another point, if you ask the question down through our history, we had a lot of Jim Crow laws saying that restaurants could not serve blacks, or trolley car companies had to have blacks sit in the back, or many other regulations like this. And you say, well, look, whenever you see a law, your first suspicion is that that law is on the books because not everybody would voluntarily obey, act according to the specification of the law. And so if white people would not serve blacks in a restaurant, why in the world would you need a law? And so the fact that there are many laws mandating discrimination suggests that, that many whites would not have discriminated in certain ways. But again, to specifically answer your question, yes, I believe that in private matters that people have the right to discriminate. And just like, I mean, I wouldn't want anybody, you know, back in 1960 when I married Mrs. Williams, I would not want anybody saying, look, you have to give white women an equal opportunity to marry you. I discriminated against all women, you know, women that get with criminal records, women that didn't bathe regularly, Italian women, Chinese women. I didn't give every woman an equal opportunity. I discriminated. And matter of fact, Mrs. Williams, she's, bless her soul, she's departed now, she required that I continue to discriminate, even though on occasion, I wanted to offer equal opportunity.
I hate when that happens. Who else? Sure. This gentleman here. This gentleman back. Yeah.
It's on. Right now, there's kind of a rift between libertarians and conservatives over the immigration issue. As a free market advocate and as an economist, where do you kind of come down on the immigration issue? Is it a benefit to a nation's economy, or do you kind of see it as a hindrance?
Well, I think when people come to our country to work and contribute to our output, I think that immigration has always been good for our country. But for most of our history, people came here legally. I believe that people should have the right to come to our country, and I think they should do so legally. We have the right to, as citizens, we have the right to demand that. And immigration has always been good for us. Now, one of the problems with immigration today is that people can, because of the welfare state, people can come to our country and live off the rest of us. And we have too many Americans living off the rest of us. And then another problem with immigration today is that for most of our history, people migrated to our country to become Americans, to learn the language, to learn our history. Today, many people come to our country and they want to bring their culture to our country. They want ballots to be written in Spanish, written in Chinese or Korean or whatever. They want to bring their culture. Many times they want to bring some of the failed aspects of their culture to the United States, such as Sharia law and honor killings and other kinds of things that we're beginning to see now. And so to answer your question, I think that there should be immigration to our country, legal immigration, and I think that I think that we should amend some of the immigration laws to make it easier for people to come to our country.
So we have time for one more question before we watch the film. But I actually want to ask if there's anyone. I'd love it if someone here has a question that really challenges, what Walter is saying. I want somebody to really go after him and really kind of challenge some of his, because I want to hear your reaction. So you're going to challenge him on something? All right, you promise? All right.
Well, I'm armed.
Here it is.
You had mentioned the fact that people don't really follow or have reverence for the Constitution anymore, and I certainly agree with that. But why is it that you and all the other conservative and libertarian commentaries don't talk about what is the purpose of a Constitution? I'm an attorney, or I was an attorney, and I can tell you that very few attorneys really understand what the function of a Constitution. And all I hear from you and others is, well, we just don't respect the Constitution anymore, but there's very little about explaining why a Constitution is so important.
Could I try?
Is that a challenge, do you think?
Good. Well, I think that the Constitution represents our rules of the game. and it represents the relationship that we should have, that we have between American and Americans and government. You'll hear some attorneys say, well, a narrow interpretation of the Constitution is wrong because the Constitution is a living document. And anyone who says that the Constitution is a living document is also saying that we do not have a Constitution. Because for the rules of the game to mean anything, they have to be fixed. Or another way to put it is to ask you, how many of you would like to play me poker tonight and the rules be living? You know, maybe my two pair under certain circumstances can beat your three of the kind, you know. Now, the founders in their wisdom, they gave us Article 5 because as a means to amend the United States Constitution because they recognized that some changes might have to be made. But again, I think that the purpose of the Constitution is to lay out the rules of the game, and also the purpose of the Constitution is to limit what the government can do, to limit the power of Congress. I mean, if you read through the Constitution, there are about 40 restrictions on Congress. Or if you look just at the Bill of Rights, I mean, the Bill of Rights, the language of the Bill of Rights says, Congress shall not infringe. Congress shall not disparage. Congress shall not prohibit. I mean, all this distrust for Congress because the founders knew that government was the enemy of mankind.
Well, okay,
but we
let
need
me
some government.
challenge you on this.
And I ask you, and I point out that when we die, and if at our next destination we see anything like the Bill of Rights, we know that we're in hell. Because a Bill of Rights in heaven would be an insult to God. I mean, that you cannot trust God.
But look, I mean, the Constitution basically allowed slavery. It basically said a black man is worth 3/5 of what a white man is. It did not allow women to vote. I mean, so a lot of people on the left who don't agree with you, they say, well, this is a racial document that disparages the rights of people that it's supposed to protect.
Well, first of all, my God, I am thankful for that compromise that made blacks count for 3/5 of a vote. And the reason why is that the slaveholding states wanted their slaves to count for one vote. And if they counted for one vote, it would give the slaveholding states more power in Congress. And so that's why there was this, and matter of fact, the Constitutional Convention could have gone down the tubes, but there's this compromise where they said, well, it's 3/5. And then the Constitution worked on the abolition of slave trade. Now, first of all, I would say that you're never going to find a perfect set of rules in the game until we get to heaven. And so, but if you say, what are the real choices here on earth? You're not going to come up with much better than the United States Constitution. It was not a perfect document. But, you know, it's more perfect than anything else, anywhere else. And it was perfect enough to have people from all the world want to come to the United States, flee to the United States. And I think that's a very good...
They still want to come.
But however, the sad thing is that many people are leaving. Businesses and others are leaving, and I think Americans ought to be concerned about why some people are leaving and taking their money with them.
Thank you. This has been incredible. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.